get underway. It's 11, and Alec might roll in and join us, but we'll start. So today we're going to start our conversation about Islam, and then we'll finish that up tomorrow. And tomorrow will be our last Zoom session, and you all at that point will sort of be on your own to finish and write and do those things. And so tomorrow you have your first two written assignments due, the one-page response paper, and then your 3-page paper. So hopefully, and I saw a couple of you have uploaded some stuff already, so that's great. And we'll just go forward. And once we stop being in Zoom session, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out via email or call the office or send me a Zoom link or invite or whatever. We can, I'm not going anywhere, so I'm still available. So what I want to do is just give us a real brief sketch sort of how things started with Islam and a little bit about Muhammad. We may talk more about some of this part of it tomorrow, but I want to make sure that we get the sort of basic, tenets and practices in place today. So Islam began on the western shore of the Arabian Peninsula, known as the Hijaz. And it was at a time when two empires dominated that region of the world. One was the Sassanid Empire, which was a Persian empire, and that was and there were people from basically Iran and modern day Iran and modern day Iraq. The other empire, obviously, was the Byzantine Empire with its capital in Constantinople, which, as we talked about yesterday, is modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And so the Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, so that was a Christian-dominated empire. And so in this region, the Hijaz region was populated by several Arab tribes. And these are basically nomadic people or semi-nomadic people. During that time, these tribal groups, some of them practiced, there were Jews and Christians, obviously, in the same region. And there was also polytheism, and polytheism was quite dominant. And so many of the folks that converted or became Muslim practiced or were engaged in some of these religious practices prior to, and they talked about a time of spiritual ignorance. So they believed that this was really a time of spiritual ignorance. One of the common shrines was the Kaaba, which is, or the cube, and it stands 45 feet tall, and it was made of granite. And the Kaaba was located in an oasis town of Mecca. And so today you'll obviously recognize that as a pilgrimage place when Muslims go on their pilgrimage annually to Mecca, and they circle this. And so, and eventually this became part of Islamic tradition. But that Kaaba, that cube was already there prior to that. Muhammad, as you all know, is the prophet of Islam. Muhammad ibn Abdullah is the prophet and founder of Islam, and he was born in 570 CE. And Islamic tradition holds that Muhammad avoided these polytheistic practices that his followers in Mecca and other places engaged in. And so they describe him as what they call Hanif, and Hanif means a monotheist in the same tradition that we would talk about Judaism, the Jewish patriarch Abraham. And so even though many people during the time that Muhammad was born were polytheistic, the tradition holds that he was monotheistic even so. All right. Muhammad's call to prophecy, and then after I lift that up, we'll shift to the sort of general practices and tenets of Islam. But his call to prophetic life began in 610 CE. So about, as I said, he was born in 570. So about 40 years after his birth is when his call to prophetic life began. And he was on a religious retreat in a mountain cave outside of Mecca, and he was visited by a being who grasped him and gave him an order to recite this. And he replied that he could not. The being commanded him 2 more times to recite, and it was revealed to him this was his first prophetic pronouncement. As he descended the mountain, the being stopped him again, coming across the horizon, and the being identified himself as the Archangel Gabriel. And, we didn't talk about this yesterday when we looked at Christianity, but the Archangel Gabriel is the same angel that announced to Mary that she was going to be with child, and that being Jesus. And so it's also the same angel who announced to Elizabeth, Mary's cousin, that she would be pregnant with John the Baptist. And so Gabriel announced to Muhammad that he was the messenger of God. And so this really begins the journey of the Islamic tradition that came about, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Islam today is the second largest religion in the world based on the number of adherents. And as I mentioned at the start of this, there's about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and there's about 2.1 or 2.2 billion Christians. And most people in the West see Islam as a religion of the Middle East. And although it began in what is modern day Saudi Arabia, it quickly spread across the globe. And if you don't know this, the largest Muslim country in the world by faith, meaning the people that are participants, is the country of Indonesia. And I like to point that out to folks because Indonesia is a constitutional democracy. And so the largest Islamic country in the world is a constitutional democracy. And there are about 200 million Muslims in Indonesia. The next largest Muslim country is Pakistan with about 175 million. And the third is India with about 160 million. And some of you one of your response papers is going to be about Islam in sort of India and basically the sort of persecution that Muslims face from Hindu nationalism. And this is an important sort of modern day advent. So I just want to highlight that today in India, Muslims are highly persecuted by the current government. And so when you do your reading and stuff about that, pay careful attention to that. Anyway. All right. Even though Islam is geographically, culturally, and linguistically diverse, it remains largely a unified religion. And this can be attributed to the Muslim vision of Tawheed, and Tawheed means oneness. In Islam, God is understood to be a single God whose oneness resonates throughout creation. Allah is the name of God in Islam. And Allah has given a single message to humanity through one messenger, the Prophet Muhammad, and that instructing humanity to join together in a single community, regardless of racial, national, social, and ethnic differences. And the singular sacred text in Islam is the Quran. And it should be pointed out here that this is important to note because In Judaism, we have the Tanakh and Torah. In Hebrew and in Christianity, we have the Bible, Old and New Testament. Those texts are considered sacred no matter what language they're in. So even if the Hebrew Bible is not in Hebrew, it's still considered sacred if it's in English or German or whatever. Just like the Christian scriptures, if they're not in Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic, they're still considered sacred. The Quran is different. The Quran is only considered sacred if it is in Arabic. And this is an important distinction, and I say that because, notice, the three largest Muslim countries on the planet, Indonesia, Pakistan, and India, none of those countries are Muslim speaking in meaning Arabic speaking countries. And so most of the people in those countries don't speak Arabic, and therefore the scriptures are for them. They don't have the capacity to read them, and so they're interpreted by someone else. And I point that out because one of the difficulties in Islam compared to other religious traditions is if you can't read the sacred text and you're relying on another person to provide you that information, then you are relying on their interpretive lens. And so this is different than particularly, shall we say, Judaism or Christianity. All right. The 5 pillars of Islam are as follows. Hold on, I'm just grabbing a link for Alex so he can join us. All right. He had some challenge with getting into Zoom this morning. All right, the 5 pillars of Islam. The first pillar is the Shahadat, and the Islamic code of conduct is founded upon the bedrock, the testimony of faith, the Shahadat. I bear witness that there is no God but God. I bear witness that Muhammad is the apostle of God. So these words are the first words breathed into a child's ear at birth, and the last which Muslims would utter with their dying breath. The lantern for life and the hope for mercy of God in the hereafter. And so this is important for us to understand. The words of the Shahadat summon Muslims to worship throughout the world. And so this is the heart of their prayer and meditation. So that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the apostle of that God, of God. All right. 2, praying together. The Quran identifies a human being as a worshiper, and also places the individual worshiper, male or female, in the context of a worshiping community. So worship is a communal act in Islam, as well as one of individual commitment. And this community orientation of Islamic worship is symbolized and demonstrated in the ritual of Salah. And that's the liturgical form of prayer, which is the duty of all Muslims to observe at fixed hours. And so there are 5 prayer times in Islam, each preceded by an obligatory ritual washing of the hands and the feet and the face. And the 5 times are dawn, midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, and at night. And you will find that Muslims will go to the mosque for these prayer times if they are able. And if they are not able to go to the mosque, they will, do it in their office or in their home or wherever. Um, and so the worshipers bow their bodies in a series of ritual movements uh, from the initial standing position, uh, and they move to their knees and they touch their forehead to the floor. It's also important to know uh, that each of the 5 sets of prayers includes the repetition of Allahu Akbar, God is greatest. So when you say that, you make that attestation. Also, they're always facing towards Mecca. So when in all mosques are oriented, that worship is always faced towards Mecca as well. Okay, number 3, almsgiving. So each Muslim is required to perform some kind of almsgiving, which is known as zakat. And zakat is obviously the giving of charity. Fasting is number 4, and there are special alms are given on these 2 religious festivals of the Islamic calendar. So the Eid al-Fitr so marks the end of Ramadan, the holy month of fasting. Um, and so fasting is very important, and it's the 4th pillar, as we talk about. And their fasting is through the daylight hours. And so this is important. Muslims will wake up early during the month of Ramadan and eat before sunrise. And then after sunset, they will break fast. And then at the end, they have a special breaking. The 5th one is the Hajj, and that is the pilgrimage to Mecca. And this is required for all Muslims to do at least once in their lifetime, obviously if they're physically and financially able. But they are required to go and do that if they are if at all possible. All right. So the next, those are the 5 pillars. The Quran sees humanity, as I said, as religious beings. And so this is what the Quran says: I created humankind only that they might worship me. So the Muslim hears God say in the Quran, and so this is central to Islamic teaching. The other is central part to Islamic teaching is submission, and the notion of submission to God. Islam understands itself fundamentally as being a natural religion, in that every created thing exists in dependence upon God, in obedience to his creative and sustaining power, and with the purpose of expressing adoration to God. So the word Muslim itself means one who lives his or her life according to God's will, and Islam means submission to God. So when someone identifies themselves as a Muslim, they are identifying themselves as someone who lives their life according to the will of God. And when we talk about the faith or the religion Islam, where actually the word means submission to God. And so there's a level of devotion in Islam that, while it's also present in other religious traditions, sometimes non-Muslim folks misinterpret this as being somehow violating their personal freedom. But the theological concept in Islam is that you are living a life in submission to God. All right, sacred writings. The Sunni majority, and there's 2 branches, 2 primary branches of Islam, Shia and Sunni. And Sunni are the majority, and the Sunni consider the Quran to be co-eternal with Allah. Now understand that. Sunnis understand the sacred text, the Quran, to be co-eternal with Allah. I'm lifting that up because one of the things that we in the West, and particularly folks that are not that knowledgeable about Islam, don't understand. When you sometimes see people burning Qurans, I mean, we should all take offense when anybody burns a sacred text. I should just put that out there uh, at the forefront, that the burning of anybody's sacred text should be offensive to any person. But if you believe that the Quran is co-eternal with the God of the universe, when someone burns that text, you are in effect having the same, causing the same effect as if you were attempting to burn God, him or herself. And so this is partially why when we see folks that engage in such practices, Muslims take a high degree offense to that because of the sacredness that they hold that text in. Um, and so this is how they sort of define it. The Quran's letters, vowel points, and writings are all created for these um, are the works of humanity, but Allah's word is uncreated. The person who says the word of Allah is created is an infidel. And so the writing down itself is a created fashion, because but the actual word. And so I just want to put that out there, that there is a different sort of general understanding. Reading the Quran is widely considered to bring rewards, increasing each. Um, the more you read it, the more reward you get. And so this is part of the reason why in Islam there's such a great focus on people memorizing large sections of the Quran, if not the entire Quran itself, because that itself gives a blessing to a person. And so, and persons that are able to do that are highly respected in the community. The Quran is divided into 114 chapters, with the exception of chapter 1, the opening. These are arranged in order of decreasing length. And so each chapter, as we go out, is shorter in its length. All right. In all, the Quran has more than 6,200 verses. Um, and so the Quranic chapters are identified with two periods. Uh, those revealed to Muhammad at Mecca, and those revealed at Medina. And so if you know, these are the two important sacred cities for Islam, Mecca and Medina. And it is believed that Muhammad received the entire Quran from Allah and then wrote it down. It's important to note that tradition holds that Muhammad was illiterate as well. Now, whether that's true or not is really aside from it. But remember when we talked about revelation and inspiration in Judaism and in Christianity, uh, we talked about how the folks that wrote down God's word, had a context and all of that. It's believed in Islamic tradition that Muhammad literally received the word from Allah and wrote it, and that there's no personal uh, input into it. And that's part of the reason why they say he was illiterate. Um, the Quran presents a sort of holistic theology uh, that claims authority over all aspects of life. And therefore, there's no separation between the sacred and the secular. Now, if you think back to last week in our conversations and some of the religious traditions that we were looking at last week, there was also no differentiation between the sacred and the secular. And so Islam shares that with some Eastern religions. All right. And as I mentioned, Arabic is the language of the Quran, and so therefore that's how it's taught and shared. Uh, some of you may have heard the term hadith. The hadith accounts are divided into two groups. And the hadith, the sacred hadith are considered to include Allah's direct words, and mediated through Muhammad, as in the case of the Quran. Whereas the prophetic hadith record Muhammad's own wise words and deeds. And so we have two types of hadith. We have a sacred hadith, and we have a prophetic hadith. And now the sacred hadith is not the same level as the Quran in terms of its holiness, but it still is the word of Allah, and again, mediated through Muhammad. Whereas the prophetic hadith are Muhammad's wise words. And they are really just sort of like words of wisdom. If any of you are familiar with Proverbs, that they're similar to Proverbs in the Hebrew scriptures. All right. The Quran recognizes earlier sacred writings, the Torah given to Moses, the Psalms given to David, and the Gospels given to Jesus. And I want to point that out because this is an important misconception that many non-Muslims have, that there is no respect for particularly the other Abrahamic faith traditions, Judaism and Christianity. But there's great respect in Islam, and the Quran recognizes that the Torah and the Psalms and the Gospels are sacred texts, and they have an important role. And in fact, Jesus is a prophet in Islam, and his miraculous birth is written about in the Quran. Now, the difference is Jesus is purely a prophet. Moses is also a prophet in Islam, and Muhammad is the last and final prophet. And so that's how Islam sort of would differentiate itself. But I want to put that out there because that's an important thing that we should know about Islam. All right, the Arabic term imam is used to designate the system of belief in Islam, drawing on Quranic verses. And so the first thing we need to know is the oneness of God. God is supreme, eternal, and omnipotent. And God sees all things and is present everywhere. So, and God is the sole creator and sustainer of the universe and controls life and death of all creatures. Now, this is an important distinction here because you notice God controls the life and death of all creatures. Now, other religious traditions have a similar view, but Islam is very insistent on this notion of the oneness of God. God has 99 names, according to Muslim belief, representing his numerous attributes and aspects. And the Hadith accounts provide for the most important source of these names. So even though there is a oneness to God, there are other names for God, and so that would be important for us to be mindful of as well. All right. Questions, observations, thoughts at this point? You all still there?
You betcha.
All right.
Yep.
All right. Okay, so that's what I really wanted to cover for today. Tomorrow, we will look at a little bit more. One of the things that about Islam. We went through some of the basic primary tenets. There's a few more that we'll look at tomorrow, and then we'll sort of look at Shia and Sunni Islam, the two main branches. The other branch, which is the mystical branch, which is Sufism, we'll touch upon that as well. But that's what we'll sort of look at tomorrow is those main branches of Islam. So, all right, have a great day, everyone. Take care of yourselves.